My name is Vanessa Morgan. I am 37 years old, and I built one of the fastest growing tech companies in New York from the ground up. I worked for every dollar, every contract, every ounce of respect. But none of that mattered on the day of my brother's wedding. What would you do if your own family treated you like you didn't belong? Would you sit quietly hoping they would see you? Or would you finally stand up for yourself, even if it meant walking away from everything? The wedding was held at the Bradford estate, a sprawling property with gardens that seemed to stretch for miles. Everything was perfect. White roses everywhere, shimmering chandeliers under the reception tent, waiters carrying champagne in tall flutes. Everyone looked like they belonged, except me. My boyfriend Daniel and I arrived on time dressed in our best. I had picked out a soft blue dress that was elegant, but not loud. I wanted to be seen, but not for the wrong reasons. When we reached the seating table, the planner smiled, scrolled through her list, then frowned. She double-checked, then asked us to wait. There was a problem with our seats, she said, but she was sure it could be worked out. I glanced at Daniel, trying to ignore the knot growing in my stomach. After a few long minutes, another woman appeared, the catering manager. She explained, her voice low and apologetic, that there had been last-minute changes. All the seats in the main reception area were filled. Instead, she would walk us to our assigned table. I followed her through a side door down a hallway, away from the sound of laughter and music. She led us into the kitchen. In the corner near the industrial refrigerators sat a small table hastily covered with a white cloth. It was barely large enough for 2 people. The catering staff moved quickly around us, heads down, pretending not to notice. I stared at the table, my heart thudding so loudly I could barely hear the rest of what she was saying. Daniel asked if there was a mistake. She apologized again. The bride had made some last-minute adjustments. There was no other space. Just this. Just the kitchen. Just me and Daniel tucked behind the scenes where no one could see us. I felt my chest tighten, a heat rising up my neck. But I stayed calm, at least on the outside. Tiffany, my brother's new wife, appeared at the door, her champagne glass catching the light. She looked so pleased with herself, like everything was just as it should be. She asked if there was a problem. I told her there was. I reminded her that I was Jacob's sister. She smiled sweetly, her voice dripping with false concern, and told me they had to prioritize their most important guests. She said Jacob had approved the seating chart this morning. It was like a cold slap. I had imagined that maybe this wedding would be the moment my family finally saw me. That maybe after everything they would recognize what I had built, who I had become. But Jacob had agreed to this. My own brother. He had seen the list. He knew where they were putting me. He chose not to fight for me. I stood there in that kitchen, surrounded by people who didn't even notice I was there. I realized in that exact moment I had spent most of my life trying to earn a seat at their table. And now, when I had built something they needed, they still shoved me into the kitchen. I wonder, have you ever been treated like this by your own family? Have you ever been made to feel invisible by the people who should have seen you most? When we were little, Jacob and I were inseparable. We spent summers chasing fireflies in our backyard and winters building snow forts until our fingers went numb. Back then, it felt like we were a team, 2 kids with scraped knees and matching grins. But things started to shift when we got older. Jacob was naturally athletic, tall and strong, the kind of boy who looked right at home on a football field. He made the varsity team in his first year, and suddenly he was the star of every family conversation. Our parents cheered at every game, standing in the front row with foam fingers and loud applause. They missed my science fairs, my debate, competitions, my piano recitals. Sometimes they showed up late, sometimes not at all. I told myself they were busy. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. I remember my 14th birthday. Jacob had just won a district football championship, and they threw a big family barbecue to celebrate him. They bought him a new watch wrapped in silver paper. My birthday cake came 3 days later from a grocery store still half frozen in the middle. They sang happy birthday, but their eyes were somewhere else. In school, I fell in love with computers. I would lose hours coding, building simple games, exploring things I didn't have words for yet. My teachers called home telling my parents how advanced I was, how I should pursue computer science seriously. My mom smiled politely and told them I was just going through a phase. Whenever I brought home a trophy, they would set it on a shelf behind the family photos. Whenever Jacob brought home a football medal, they framed it and hung it in the living room. It wasn't that they didn't love me. I think they just didn't see me. Not in the way I wanted to be seen. Jacob got picked for homecoming court. My parents beamed through the whole ceremony, snapping photos like their lives depended on it. When I won the state science fair the same year, they sent a text message. "Good job." That was it. I started to notice how our family dinners always circled back to Jacob's games, Jacob's friends, Jacob's future. When I tried to talk about my projects, the conversation would drift away like they couldn't quite hold on to my words. One time I overheard my dad telling a family friend that Jacob was going to carry the family legacy. He said Jacob had what it takes to lead the next generation. When asked about me, he just laughed and said, "Vanessa is our little computer girl. She keeps herself busy." It stayed with me the way those words slid past so easily. I was busy. I was not the legacy. I was not the story they wanted to tell at holiday dinners. Jacob wasn't cruel. He just enjoyed being the center of their world. I can't blame him for that. Maybe part of me even wanted to be him just for a moment, just to know what it felt like to be the one they waited for. The one they bragged about, the one who always had a seat saved at the table. But I was the quiet one, the one with a laptop instead of cleats. The one whose name didn't echo through stadiums but stayed written on certificates stuffed in drawers. The one who kept hoping that maybe next time they would notice. Maybe next time I would matter. As we grew up, the space between Jacob and me stretched wider. He stepped right into the family business, Morgan Construction, without missing a beat. Dad made sure there was always a role waiting for him, even if Jacob barely passed his business classes. No one questioned his place. He was the obvious choice, the one they had been preparing for all along. I took a different path. I worked in small tech companies, grinding through long nights, learning everything from the ground up. I saved every dollar, skipped vacations, ate cheap takeout in my apartment that doubled as my office. When I told my parents about starting my own company, they smiled like I had just announced a new hobby. Mom told me I was brave for trying, but reminded me I could always come work for the family if things didn't work out. Dad didn't ask what I was building. He asked if I had been eating properly. It was the kind of concern that sounded caring on the surface, but never went any deeper. In those early years, I wanted them to ask about my work. I wanted them to see how much I was risking, how hard I was pushing. Instead, family dinners stayed centered on Jacob, his construction projects, his golf tournaments, his weekend trips with Dad to scout new sites. I remember calling them after I signed my first real client. I was buzzing with excitement. I had closed a deal that meant I could finally move my company out of my apartment and into a real office. Dad congratulated me, and then quickly shifted the conversation back to Jacob's latest promotion. It wasn't just that they didn't celebrate me. It was that they didn't even seem curious. I was building something from scratch, something real, but to them it always felt small. I was their daughter with a nice little side project. Jacob was the one building the future. I tried again a few months later. I brought home a press article featuring Morgan Tech. My parents glanced at it but didn't comment. Jacob showed them a photo of his new truck, and the room lit up. I kept that article folded in my bag the whole night. They never asked to read it. The more I succeeded, the quieter their approval became. It was like they didn't know what to do with me once I didn't need their help. Jacob was always the safe bet. I was the question mark they never tried to answer. Even when Morgan Tech landed national clients, my wins were treated like polite footnotes. I was the sibling who was doing fine on her own, but not the one they were proud to talk about at barbecues or holiday gatherings. I think somewhere deep down I kept hoping they would see me. I wanted to hear Dad tell someone Vanessa is building something amazing. I wanted to hear Mom brag about me the way she bragged about Jacob. But those words never came. What settled in me instead was something quieter, something heavier. I stopped trying to impress them, but I never really stopped wanting to. Over time, that gap between us became more than just distance. It became something I could not cross, no matter how far I had climbed. Morgan Tech hit its turning point in the third year. After months of pushing, we finally secured a major contract with Bradford Group, one of the biggest real estate developers on the East Coast. It was the kind of deal that could double our size and open doors I had been knocking on for years. The contract didn't come through Jacob. It didn't come from family connections or favors. It came because we were good. Bradford's operations team found us at a tech summit. They saw our software ran the numbers and decided we were exactly what they needed. When I realized who owned Bradford Group, I thought it was fate. Tiffany's family, my soon-to-be sister-in-law. I had worked hard to build that contract from the ground up. Maybe this was the moment my family would finally see me not as a side note, but as someone who mattered. I told my parents about the deal thinking they would finally be proud. My mother simply smiled and asked if I had received my invitation to Jacob and Tiffany's engagement party. She was more excited about the party than the fact that her daughter had just signed a multi-million-dollar contract. At the party, I met Richard Bradford for the first time. He was charismatic and polite. He complimented the software and said his team was excited to roll it out across all their properties. He didn't know I was Jacob's sister. He only knew me as the CEO of Morgan Tech. When my mother saw us talking, her eyes lit up with nervous energy. She laughed and explained that I was just their little computer genius. She called it my hobby again, right in front of Richard. I corrected her gently. This was my company. This was my work. Richard was surprised. He said Jacob had never mentioned me or the fact that Morgan Tech was family. That moment stuck with me. It wasn't an accident. Jacob had made sure his future in-laws didn't know that his sister was leading the company providing their critical software. It was just like before. I was still being kept in the background, still being boxed into the role they had written for me long ago. Even so, I told myself this time would be different. The contract was undeniable. The results were measurable. It would be impossible to ignore me now. I believed the wedding would be a fresh start, a chance to stand in the open as the sister, the CEO, the one they had overlooked for too long. Part of me still wanted to believe that. I carried that hope all the way to the wedding day, holding on to the idea that maybe this time they would see me. This time they would be proud to claim me. But deep inside, I think I always knew the truth. Something was still not right. Something was always waiting to push me back to where they thought I belonged. Morgan Tech had spent years fighting for a place at the table. We worked late nights, chased every lead, and pushed through doors that always seemed half closed. Then we landed it. A breakthrough contract with Bradford Group, a major real estate developer with national reach. The deal came through our own work. Their operations team saw our demo at a tech conference and reached out. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know I was connected to Jacob. They just saw a product that could save them millions. When we signed the contract, I felt something shift. It wasn't just money or prestige. It felt like proof. For once, the numbers spoke louder than the family stories. I thought maybe this would finally be enough. Maybe they would have to see me now. I told my parents about it during one of our regular calls. They listened politely. My mother quickly changed the topic to Jacob and Tiffany's engagement party. She sounded thrilled about the guest list, the venue, the menu. She never asked for details about the deal. I brushed it off, thinking maybe they didn't understand how big it was. I thought they would see it at the wedding. I imagined them introducing me proudly, talking about Morgan Tech, about how I was leading something important. Maybe the wedding would finally be that moment. At the engagement party, I met Richard Bradford. He was kind, sharp, and completely unaware of who I was beyond my title. He praised the software and said their team was excited about the partnership. It surprised him to find out that I was Jacob's sister. My mother laughed nervously and waved it off. She said I had always been the family's little computer whiz. She called it a hobby. I corrected her, but she was already turning the conversation back to Jacob. Richard looked confused but didn't press. Later, I realized why Richard had no idea. Jacob never told him. He had left that part out on purpose. He had separated me from the story. Even with this contract, even with all the work I had done, he made sure I stayed out of sight. I told myself it didn't matter. The work would speak for itself. The contract was already signed. The results would be impossible to ignore. Maybe the wedding would still be a chance to close that distance. I wanted to believe that, but somewhere deep inside I felt that old pattern creeping back, that quiet push to keep me on the edges. I tried to silence it, but it stayed there, humming underneath everything, waiting for me to see the truth. I wasn't ready to see it yet. I still wanted to believe I had finally earned my place. A few days before the wedding, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. Jacob's texts were shorter than usual, filled with vague updates about last-minute changes and seating adjustments. He said things were chaotic, but everything was under control. When I tried to call him to check in, he answered, but he sounded distracted. He brushed off my questions and told me not to worry about the details. He promised I would have a great time, but something about his voice made me pause. I wanted to ask him directly where I would be sitting, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to seem like I was making it about me. I convinced myself this was just wedding stress. Everyone scrambles at the last minute, right? Even when I offered to help with anything, he politely turned me down. He said they had it covered. He sounded distant, like I was just another guest, not his sister. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself I wasn't going to ruin this by being suspicious. Daniel asked me if I was sure about going. He knew my family history. He knew what it meant to me to finally feel seen. I told him I had to go. I told him this time would be different. I picked out my dress carefully. It was the perfect shade of blue, elegant but simple. I wanted to walk in and feel like I belonged. I wanted them to see me for who I was now, not who they had always assumed I would be. But the night before the wedding, Jacob texted me again. He mentioned that the guest list had grown and some things had to be rearranged. He didn't say more. He told me not to worry. He said it would all make sense when I got there. I stared at his message for a long time. Something about it felt unfinished, like he was hiding something. I almost called him again, but I didn't. I told myself to trust him. I told myself that he wouldn't let me down. I wanted this wedding to be the moment that finally changed everything. I pushed away the unease sitting in my chest. I focused on the picture I had in my head. I walked into that day still believing this would be my seat at the table. I still wanted to believe it was finally my turn to belong. When we arrived at the reception, the air buzzed with music and the soft clinking of glasses. The garden tent glowed under crystal chandeliers, every table perfectly set with white linen and gold trim. Guests moved easily from table to table, laughter rising in warm waves, everyone looking like they belonged. Daniel and I walked to the seating chart, expecting to find our names somewhere near the family section. The planner's polite smile faltered as she scrolled through her tablet. She checked the list again, then told us there had been a small mix-up. She asked us to wait for just a moment while she double-checked. I looked around, feeling the weight of people passing by without noticing us. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself they would fix it. But the planner returned with a catering manager and a forced apology. They told us the main reception was now full. They said there had been unexpected guests, last-minute changes. They told us our seats had been reassigned. They asked us to follow them. We walked down a side hallway, away from the music, away from the polished tables and glowing lights. The sounds of the reception faded as we passed through a service door into the kitchen. There, tucked in a corner between a supply shelf and a prep table, sat a small round table covered in a white cloth. 2 chairs, 2 sets of silverware, 2 plates set apart from the rest of the celebration. I stared at it, my throat tightening. Daniel asked if this was a mistake. The catering manager avoided our eyes and repeated the words they had been told to say. There was no mistake. The bride had confirmed the seating herself. Tiffany appeared in the doorway holding a glass of champagne. She looked at me like I was exactly where I should be. I asked her what this was. I reminded her I was Jacob's sister. She smiled softly and said the most important guests had to be prioritized. She said Jacob had approved the seating this morning. The words landed like a punch. Jacob knew. Jacob agreed. My own brother had seen the seating chart and let this happen. I searched her face for any trace of kindness, but there was none. There was no confusion, no regret. This was deliberate. Daniel stepped forward to protest, but I raised my hand to stop him. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I felt myself falling backward into every moment I had ever been left behind. Every birthday they forgot. Every science fair they skipped. Every quiet dismissal folded into polite smiles. I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was the pattern. This was exactly where they thought I belonged. Not at the table. Not in the room. In the kitchen. Out of sight. My chest burned as I tried to steady my breathing. I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. I thought I had climbed out of this. I thought I had built something they couldn't ignore. But even now, with everything I had achieved, they still made space for me behind the scenes. It wasn't just about the seat. It was the message. They wanted me small. They wanted me grateful for crumbs. And they never thought I would dare to push back. In that moment, something inside me snapped. Quietly. Fully. I stood there watching Tiffany sip her champagne like she had already won, and I realized I would never let them seat me in the kitchen again. I had finally seen the truth. I had finally reached the edge of what I could accept. I stepped outside the kitchen, the cold air brushing against my skin, steadying me. Daniel followed but kept his distance, giving me the space he knew I needed. My hands shook slightly as I reached for my phone, but my voice was steady when I called Gregory my COO. I told him to cancel the contract with Bradford Group. I told him to start the termination process immediately. I spoke clearly, knowing exactly what I was saying and what it would cost. Gregory paused, confused. I told him this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't emotional. It was the right decision. I made sure he understood I wasn't walking away in anger. I was walking away in self-respect. When I walked back into the reception, the tent was still alive with music and conversation. No one noticed me at first. They had already decided I was invisible. I crossed the room and stood near the head table where Richard, Bradford, Jacob, and Tiffany were deep in discussion with other business partners. I heard Richard talking about Morgantech's system, about how it was going to transform their operations. Jacob sat beside him, his shoulders straight, his voice full of confidence. I waited until Richard finished his sentence before I spoke. I told them the system they were praising belonged to me. I reminded them that I was not just Jacob's sister. I was the CEO of Morgantech. I told them I had just canceled their contract. The silence hit the table like a stone dropped in still water. Richard's eyes narrowed. Jacob's mouth opened, but no words came out. Tiffany's face tightened her hand, clenching the fabric of her dress. Richard asked me if I was serious. I told him it was already done. Jacob stammered something about talking later about sorting this out. I told him there was nothing left to sort. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke plainly, each word landing with weight. I told them I didn't do business with people who couldn't offer basic respect. I told them seating me in the kitchen made it very clear how they valued me. Richard pressed, asking if I would reconsider. I told him no. I told him this wasn't about seating anymore. It was about what that choice revealed. Tiffany tried to smooth it over, calling it a misunderstanding. I reminded her that Jacob had approved the seating. I told her I knew it wasn't a mistake. I saw her composure crack. Other guests nearby had fallen silent, their eyes flicking between us, watching it all unfold. I didn't care. I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't the one who had something to hide. I told Richard I wished him well, but the partnership was finished. I thanked him for the opportunity, then walked away. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. Daniel caught up with me near the valet, his face lighting up with quiet pride. I felt light, like I had finally dropped a weight I had been carrying for years. I had spent so long trying to be seen. In the end, I only needed to see myself. I wasn't leaving that wedding angry. I was leaving free. I had finally chosen myself. That was the only approval I ever really needed. The morning after the wedding, my inbox filled with messages I never expected. Executives from other companies who had been at the reception were reaching out. They wanted to meet. They wanted to know more about Morgantech. Some of them had overheard the confrontation. Some had seen the way I handled myself. They said they admired the way I stood firm. They said they respected the decision I made, even though it cost me. One of them was Thomas from Eastbridge Development. He had been sitting near the head table. He called my office first thing that morning. He said he had done his research on Morgantech and was ready to discuss a deal. Another call came from Apex Investments. They had watched the whole thing unfold from a distance. They said they were interested in funding Morgantech's international expansion. They said the way I walked away from Bradford showed the kind of leadership they wanted to back. I sat at my desk, reading their emails, feeling something loosen inside me. For years, I thought I had to chase approval to get the next opportunity. I thought I had to prove myself in the right rooms, at the right tables, to the right people. But the moment I stopped chasing, the doors opened. The moment I stopped begging for a seat, people offered me better ones. People who saw me. people who respected me without needing me to shrink. I told Gregory to schedule the meetings. I told him we were moving forward stronger than ever. The Bradford contract would have been big, but these new opportunities felt clean. They felt earned. That afternoon, I called Eleanor from Bradford Group to confirm the termination paperwork. She sounded tired but professional. She told me that the replacement system was already behind schedule. She told me they were struggling without Morgan Tech's support. I wished her well. I told her I hoped her team landed on their feet. I meant it. This wasn't about punishment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. By the end of the week, we had 2 new contracts in motion. The numbers added up to more than what we lost. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt peace. For years, I had carried this weight, always trying to catch up to the version of success my family would finally respect. I had told myself I needed to win their approval to finally be enough. But I didn't. The people who saw my value now weren't family. They weren't clapping from the sidelines out of obligation. They wanted to work with me because of who I was, not who they needed me to be. I sat in my office as the sun set, letting that feeling settle. I realized I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I wasn't hoping they would call, hoping they would finally see me. I had seen myself. And that was what changed everything. A few weeks after the wedding, Jacob reached out. He asked to meet for lunch, just the 2 of us. I almost said no, but something in me wanted to hear what he had to say. We sat at a small table by the window of a quiet restaurant. For a while, neither of us spoke. Jacob looked tired, his words slow when they finally came. He admitted he had always felt like he had to be the one carrying the family's name. He said it scared him when I started doing well. It made him feel small in a story where he had always been the main character. He told me he had let Tiffany make the seating decision because it was easier to pretend I was still the quiet sister in the background. He said he knew it was wrong, but at the time he didn't have the courage to stop it. I listened. I didn't rescue him from the weight of those words. I told him I forgave him, but I made it clear I would never let myself be treated that way again. I told him forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. I told him I had learned to protect myself. Jacob nodded. He didn't try to argue. He didn't try to explain it away. Maybe for the first time he really saw me. Our relationship didn't snap back to what it used to be. But there was space now. A space where maybe we could rebuild something more honest. In the months that followed, I stayed focused on Morgan Tech. But something in me wanted to do more. I wanted to help women who were walking the same road I had traveled. Women building businesses while carrying the heavy weight of family doubt. So I started a mentorship program called The Seat. It was for women who didn't need permission to succeed. Women who didn't want to wait for someone else to offer them a chair. Women who would build their own table if they had to. We met every week sharing stories that felt so familiar. Stories of being overlooked, of being told to stay small, of finally realizing we didn't have to. Helping those women helped me heal parts of myself I didn't know were still raw. I started to understand that self-worth isn't something you earn from others. It's something you claim for yourself. Looking back, I see now that the real shift wasn't when I canceled the contract or walked away from that reception. It was when I finally believed that I deserved more. It was when I stopped waiting to be chosen. I know what it feels like to beg for a seat. I know what it feels like to wonder if you'll ever be good enough. But I also know that the most powerful thing you can do is to stop waiting. To take your place, not because someone gave it to you, but because you know you've earned it. Whatever your story is, wherever you are, I hope you remember this. You don't need anyone's approval to know your own worth. You deserve a seat at the table. And if they won't make room for you, you have the power to walk away and build your own.